Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's Steve Millies. I'm a member of the faculty here at Catholic Theological Union, as well as the director of the Bernardin Center, where Chicago's Cardinal Joseph Bernardin asked CTU to continue his legacy and vision for the Catholic Church, a vision of a church reaching out to the world. That's what brings us here tonight, where the Bernardin Center is proud to be able to offer space and an opportunity for all of us to celebrate 40 years of the Hispanic Theology and Ministry program here at CTU, as well as this important series of academic studies, Disruptive Cartographers from Fordham University Press, that has been generated in and with and through the Hispanic Theology and Ministry program. Before we begin, I want to make a few short acknowledgements. And let's begin with acknowledging the land upon which Chicago sits and from which this event is transmitted via Zoom out to the world. We acknowledge this land, which was once occupied and revered by the Council of the Three Fires, comprised of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. We thank those early inhabitants of Chicago for the way they revered this generous land. And I also want to acknowledge in a different way the presence here with us tonight in the room of CTU's president, Sister Barbara Reed. Sister Barbara's presence is a sign not only of how important the Hispanic Theology and Ministry program is here at CTU, but it also signals Sister Barbara's own personal investment in that program. For all of us, we're grateful you're here with us tonight as a member of the audience, joining us in celebration. If you're not already familiar with Catholic Theological Union, please let me say this brief word about us, and if you are familiar with us, please bear with me. Catholic Theological Union began in 1968, in the moments immediately following the Second Vatican Council, when three communities of religious men, the Franciscans, the Passionists, and the Servites, formed this union to bring their theologates together in the city, near a great university, to answer the call of Vatican II that sought to bring the church to the world. Today, 23 men's communities form this union, and our students include their members and also include women from a number of religious communities, as well as many lay people who want a theological education and preparation for ministry. If you'd like to learn more about CTU, join us for more events like this one, or if you're thinking about studying with us, come learn more at ctu.edu. And now, with a little bit of business finally transacted, it's my pleasure to introduce our guests for tonight. To my right, and to the Zoom viewing audience's left, is Miguel H. Diaz, the John Courtney Murray S.J. University Chair in Public Service at Loyola University, Chicago. A Latino theologian, Diaz has been co-editor of several books, including the Disruptive Cartographers Doing Theology Latinamente series from Fordham University Press. He's the editor of Volume 1, The Word Became Culture, and the author of Volume 3, Queer God de Amor. He writes regularly for the Theology on La Plaza column with the National Catholic Reporter. And of course, Diaz served under President Barack Obama as the 9th US ambassador to the Holy See. We also have with us tonight via Zoom, Jean-Pierre Ruiz, who teaches at St. John's University in New York, where he's also a senior fellow of the university's Vincentian Center for Church and Society. A leading Latino biblical scholar, he's the author of the award-winning books Readings from the Edges, The Bible and People on the Move, and Revelation in the Vernacular, Volume 2 in the Disruptive Cartographers series. During the Obama administration, he served as a core group member of the US State Department's Working Group on Religion and Foreign Policy. And finally, my friend and CTU colleague, Carmen Nanco Fernandez, is professor of Hispanic Theology and Ministry and director of the Hispanic Theology and Ministry program here at CTU. She's the founding co-editor of the multi-volume Disruptive Cartographers series and creator of the Theology on La Plaza column with the National Catholic Reporter. A Latino theologian, her work appears in Commonweal, and her publications include the book Theologizing en Spanglish. She's currently completing El Santo, Baseball, and the canonization of Roberto Clemente. And as far as we all know, she has never served in the Obama administration, which distinguishes her from the rest of our panel. So I want to offer a welcome to our panelists here tonight. We're very grateful all of you are here with us for this very happy occasion, as we're grateful to the audience. And with that, we'll get everything underway while I invite my colleague Carmen to open things up.
Thank you, Steve. Bienvenidos. Gracias for joining us as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of CTU's Hispanic Theology and Ministry program in conjunto with the Bernardin Center's book launch events. The story of our program, one of the oldest of its kind in Catholic graduate theological education, is entwined with the history of Latino theologies. What we understand today as Latino theologies arose in the context of the USA almost half a century ago from scholars and pastoral ministers identifying under a broad umbrella of Hispanidad y Latinidad. Described by one of our pioneers, Roberto Goizueta, as, quote, theology done from a self-consciously US Hispanic perspective, end quote, we find expression primarily in English, some bilingual and in Spanish, and others of us even in Spanglish. In some ways, kin to Latin American liberation theologies and Teología del Pueblo, these theologies are distinguished in part by their rootedness within particularities and complexities of lived experiences of Latinos in the USA, by their option for culture, and by what another one of our pioneers, Orlando Espín, once described as a rebellious hermeneutic. The Disruptive Cartographers series is consistent with these impulses and pushes out even further, charting new trajectories, retrieving forgotten sources, and exploring areas too long avoided in theology. Launched throughout the pandemic and mindful of the call of Pope Francis, Hagan Leo, the volumes in the series stir things up in constructive ways with hopes for a better day. And with that, our first question goes to Miguel Diaz. The reception of Queer God de Amor, the third and most recent volume in the series, has touched many readers, especially in the LGBTQ plus community, in very profound ways. One reviewer noted that, quote, many in the LGBTQ communities feel the church has no good news message for them and no sense that Christianity is an invitation to intimacy with God, end quote. Miguel, how do you see your book as responding to this lived reality? And what would you identify as a central disruptive insight that you offer in what is at its heart a book on Trinitarian theology?
Thank you, Carmen, and thank you, Jean-Pierre and Steve and everyone here at CTU. That's my first word. Gratitude for organizing this event this evening. In answer to Carmen's question, I love the fact that we are able to have this hybrid across the country. Perhaps one of the first events that we're able to connect this way. I guess what I would say is that I think one of the most difficult and painful experiences for members of the LGBTQ plus community, especially for Catholics, and I'm speaking as someone who has experiences, is the fact that there are so very few images, spiritual practices, theological constructions that speak to queer human experiences. And as the person that Carmen quoted, suggests, there is a prevalent view among queer persons that Christianity does not offer an opportunity of intimacy with God, and that queer persons are unable to tap into their own human experiences, in particular their sexuality, as a way to offer any kind of good news to others. And so I wrote this book partly out of that experience. and also as a result of my accompaniment of other queer Catholic persons in general, and queer Catholics in general, and in other queer persons that are members of the of Christian traditions, and others that have abandoned Christian churches, sadly, because of this religious issue. At times, the gulf between spirituality and queer sexuality is very real, and tragically can often lead to life-threatening situations for many of us. So Queer Got Them More responds to this void, this spiritual and theological void. It's a response, not clearly the response, but it's a response by querying the mystery of God. That is, and I use that very specific term for querying, by questioning heteronormative informed spiritualities, metaphors, images, and constructions of the triune life of God. And this is key for my work. In continuity with Christian mystics, my book disrupts idolatrous theological constructions of divine life. And I offer, Queer Got Them More as a way to continue this Christian reflection on the mystery of God. To source this book, as many of you who have read it already know, I turn to San Juan de la Cruz, and in particular, his spirituality and disruptive insight that God is un no sé qué, and I know not what. I know not what. And so that points to that, that ineffable aspect of God that Christian theologians have attempted to name from the very beginning, right? That we began the Christian theological reflection on the nature of God, and express that in creedal forms and in the theological reflections that have contributed to the development of Trinitarian theology. My book, however, and I want to make this clear, is not just about a disruption. It's not just about a disruptive moment, as the series, all the books in the series invite us to do. The book, it's also about creating. The book is not just disrupting, but it is also about creating Sanjuanistamente, a different vision, a different understanding of God. It's about constructing a different understanding of God. And in that sense, it follows both a via negativa as well as a via positiva. It both negates and constructs, enabling me to relate mysticism to queer sexuality, and affirming precisely this central notion that Juan has as un no sé qué, as a way to expand the possibilities for queer persons, queer Christians, to see themselves imaged in the image of this God who is beyond understanding. So I think that, for me, then, I would say, building upon this notion of no sé qué, we want this to be a conversation among the four of us. And so I would like, to turn to Jean-Pierre and ask, based on this, to say, well, for me, Jean-Pierre, doing theology Sanjuanistamente means affirming this mystery named in terms of the un no sé qué. But for you, Jean-Pierre, what does it mean to take the incarnation seriously in formulating a theology of revelation? What would you identify as a key disruptive insight from your work that you want to offer us, and that you offer in Revelation in the vernacular?
Thanks so much for that question, Miguel. It's actually the sort of question that I wish we had more than an hour to discuss Latinamente, because there is so much that it invites us to explore. You just pointed out that for St. John of the Cross and Juan de la Cruz, God is ineffable, that God is un no sé qué, and I know not what. Paradoxically, though, the claim that Christians dare to make, and it's a claim that Jews and Muslims, along with others, also make, is that God can be known, and that it is God, in fact, who takes the initiative, who makes making that possible, in making God's self known. And that claim, which is the very core of any theology of revelation, that is, any theology of divine self-disclosure, is one that certainly has disruptive dimensions. Conventionally, though, that sometimes loses its edge. It's sometimes buried among the pages and pages of tomes about the relationship between scripture and tradition. The audacity of the Christian claim enunciated in the doctrine of the incarnation, that the second person of the Trinity became fully human, is very much over the top, is very, very disruptive, if you will. I have been taken, and this is what shows up in the pages of Revelation in the vernacular, by an encounter that took place in a cave on a small, now uninhabited island some miles off the coast of Puerto Rico. And it's about an encounter that took place and that is memorialized by 3 inscriptions when Spanish colonizers visited Cave 18 on the island of Mona, where they saw hundreds of indigenous glyphs that were carved into the soft rock surface of this cave. And this was in chambers that were well beyond the reach of daylight. So they had to work to get there, and they probably were led there by people who knew what was already there. And they left 3 inscriptions behind, 2 in Latin, 1 in Spanish. Verbum caro factum est, the word became flesh, and plura fecit Deus, God made many things. And in Spanish, Dios te perdone, may God forgive you. Now, these inscriptions have only recently been discovered by archaeologists working in the area, but they represent remarkable instances of interreligious encounter that go well against the grain of how Spanish colonizers typically dealt with what they regarded as expressions of indigenous religion among the peoples that they colonized. And their typical reaction was a matter of cultural erasure. They burned the books, they destroyed the glyphs, they defaced the sculptures and so on. Not here. Well, why not? What was the language that was available to them? What was the hermeneutic that was available to them that led them to honor these indigenous glyphs that they perhaps didn't quite understand, with phrases like God made many things and the word was made flesh? Well, as I crossed the Atlantic, at least in terms of my library resources, to see what was circulating in Spain at the time, I ran into a most fascinating character, Fray Luis de Leon, 16th century Augustinian theologian, professor at the University of Salamanca, and poet in his own right, who developed a theology of translation into the vernacular that was rooted on a very deep Christology, a very deep theology of the incarnation. And it's that sophisticated theology that provided the underpinning for his own translation of texts from the Hebrew Bible, and specifically the Song of Songs and the Book of Job, from Hebrew into Spanish. In an environment that was acutely sensitive to issues of biblical translation because of the role in Europe of vernacular translations in advancing the Reformation, this made Fray Luis something of a disruptor himself, and it got him into trouble with the Inquisition. Ultimately, though, he was acquitted, and according to legend, when he returned to his cathedra at the University of Salamanca, he got up and began his lecture by saying, as we were saying the other day, he was not without a sense of humor. So this was Luis de Leon, who provides a language for understanding incarnation in a much broader sense with greater latitude than many of his contemporaries did. If this was the sort of thing that was circulating in Spain in this era, perhaps, and we have no clue of whether Luis influenced these folks, but perhaps it's a key to understanding how this visitor to Cave 18 on Mona Island was able to declare God did many things, and another to say the word was made flesh. And not only the word in Latin, not only the word in Spanish, but the word as expressed in these glyphs made in the stone of Cave 18 by the Taino population that was there.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre, and thank you, Miguel. Part of the wisdom of the series, and Jean-Pierre, you started taking us there when you were talking about Fray Luis de Leon. Part of the wisdom of the series was to encourage authors to retrieve sources from the vast diversity of theologizing across the spectrum of global Hispanidad y Latinidad. These are often from sources that were marginalized even within the so-called canon, and certainly absent in English-speaking theological circles. So I guess I'd like to ask each of you, what would each of you like the folks who are gathered here today to know about the sources you chose, both ancient sources and contemporary sources, the sources that you chose to retrieve in your respective volumes, and why do you think that these sources would even make a difference for us today? And so Miguel, if you wouldn't mind going first, and then Jean-Pierre, about your sources that you retrieved and why you think they matter today.
So thank you, Carmen. You've asked a difficult question, because we're being asked to to sort of like highlight a couple of things that attracted each of us to these sources. I've already alluded to one of them, and that's the mystical theology of John of the Cross, and the fact that I believe that in every mystic is mysticism is in itself queer, as I understand queer, and as many understand the word queer today, in terms of queer theory, queer theology, in terms of questioning, right? Mysticism resists the kind of boxing, especially not only of human beings, but of God, into any kind of predetermined definitions, situations, experiences, names, etc. So I would definitely want the readers, to know that I find John of the Cross and his mystical theology an ally to exploring not only the very mystery of God, but an ally in queer theological efforts that seek to disrupt, particularly heteronormativity and heteronormative understandings of God and of the human being. But I want to highlight two things specifically when it comes to the question that you raised. The first one has to do with context. The second one has to do with the source, with poetry as a source. So first, with respect to context, I want us to be aware that Juan de la Cruz is heir to a rich Iberian tradition that was very much at ease in terms of engaging the so-called secular and the so-called religious literature. In fact, these two blended into one another, and he had also a history of coming from a very religious, pluralistic environment and context in terms of the Jewish, the Muslim, and the Christian relations. They were part of the Iberian Peninsula. A lot of the poems, and this is certainly the case for O Llama de Amor Viva, Living Flame of Love, comes from a region of Spain, Andalusia, once Al-Andalus, that had also a very rich history when it came to erotic and homoerotic literature. And so in some ways, this is a natural, this is a natural in the sense, this is a someone that lent himself to this kind of engagement. And so I want to quote Shari Lowen, who in her book, Arabic and Hebrew Love Poems, writes, quote, the term and concept, and this is the whole notion of the secular and the religious, the term and concept belong to the modern worldview. In Muslim Spain, for instance, rather than separating the spiritual world and the physical world, distinguishing between what the modern world deems as the secular and the religious realms, Muslim and Jewish authority figures fuse the two. And I think that's important because what I'm doing in this book is to say that for too long, sadly, the mystics, including John of the Cross, have been strict of that kind of sensuality and sexuality. And, just to piggyback on what my colleague Jean-Pierre just stated, the word becomes flesh. It becomes all of flesh. It doesn't exempt any part of our flesh. So that's the first point. The second point is to focus on poetry. The great Karl Rahner, 20th century theologian, systematic theologian, affirmed that the poetic word is the language closest to the mystery of God and, quote, the presupposition to hearing the word of God. John of the Cross is one of those who, and mystics have also part of this tradition, who turn to the poetic word as a way to describe the mystery of God. In a book about the triune mystery of God, I wanted to retrieve poetry in line with these theological insights that say the poetic word is closer than the prose is to that mystery, because it resists the kind of, it's open-ended, and it resists the kind of confinement. And so the very nature of poetic language as art invites us to imagine anew. And Juan de la Cruz himself writes, don't take my prose as the last word in here. The poems are meant to be reinterpreted and reinterpreted in accordance with the presence of God's Spirit in human history. So I took him as my invitation to do this, and to do it in a way that spoke to queer sexuality, to queer humanity. And so I just want to end this part before we continue the conversation by reading, the translation is my translation, the central poem that really resources my book, and that is O Llama de Amor Viva. I will read it in English. O living flame of love that tenderly wounds my soul in its deepest center. Shy, you are no more. Do it now, if you will. Break the veil of this sweet encounter. O delicate cautery, O grace-filled wound, O gentle hand, O delicate touch that tastes of eternal life, and repays all my debt. Healing, you turn my death into life. O lamps of fire in whose splendors the deep caverns of the senses, once obscured and blind, now give forth so rarely and exquisitely both warmth and light to his beloved. How gentle and loving my heart recalls the place where you alone secretly dwell, and by your tasty breath, replete with goodness and glory, how tenderly you seduce me. You can see that it doesn't take much imagination to draw some very concrete implications from that poem.
Jean-Pierre.
Thank you for the question. As I thought about our conversation this evening, the question that emerges from that set of considerations that you put on the table is, what makes this work of mine anything more than an interesting historical artifact about 16th century Spain? Well, I want us to fast forward several centuries to the fall of 2019, where the first pope from the global south, the first pope from the American hemisphere, convened the Special Assembly of the Synod of Bishops for the Pan-Amazonian region for a variety of reasons. Among them is concern for the environmental degradation that was afflicting and continues to afflict Amazonia. And second, out of respect for the indigenous populations of Amazonia, to make them participants, to invite them to be participants in the culture of dialogue, in the culture of encounter that has been a hallmark of this pontificate. It's hard to imagine how this could possibly have happened in Rome in the autumn of 2019, had someone other than Francis been the Bishop of Rome, particularly since in his capacity as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he had a leading role in composing the final document of the General Assembly of the Conference of Latin American Bishops at Aparecida in Brazil in 2007. So another piece of the retrieval that takes place in Revelation in the vernacular is a retrieval of events that took place and statements that were made during the course of the Amazonian Synod, in Pope Francis's own post-synodal exhortation, Querida Amazonia, and looking back at the series of documents issued by the Latin American bishops in their early gatherings, to see how they come more and more explicitly to reckon with the reality of incarnation, particularly as it manifests itself in the indigenous cultures of Latin America. Perhaps the most shocking and the most noteworthy, the most newsworthy event that took place during the Amazonian Synod was something that took place on October 21st, 2019. A video surfaced on YouTube with the title Pachamama Idols Thrown into the River. Well, these were 5 wooden carvings depicting a pregnant indigenous woman. These carvings had been used in a prayer service in the Vatican Gardens just before the beginning of the Synod, and then together with other objects had been placed reverently in a side chapel of the Church of Santa Maria in Traspontina, not far from St. Peter's Basilica. These carvings were stolen and thrown into the Tiber, with those responsible claiming wrongly that these images were an instance of idolatry, when in fact nothing could have been further from the truth than that. My retrieval of material from the Amazonian Synod, from the post-synodal exhortation, and from the documents of the Latin American bishops, as they come to terms with culture as a vehicle as an instrument of revelation, culture and incarnation co-implicated with each other, is a retrieval that makes my book much, much more than an exercise in the retrieval of obscure 16th century Iberian scholarship. Because understanding a hermeneutics of the vernacular, understanding what takes place in terms of God's interaction with human beings and God's self-disclosure to human beings, is a rich and fascinating and complex set of considerations.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. And I'm going to take this space just to remind our audience, both here in the room and also joining us over Zoom, that we're going to be inviting your questions and comments in just a little while. So begin formulating what those might be, if you like. And for those of us who are joining us on Zoom, you can begin feeding those questions into the chat feature, and we'll begin capturing them here as well. But as long as I have my mouth open, I will claim a brief privilege and ask a question of my own of our 2 authors, Miguel and Jean-Pierre. The volumes in the series respond, each in their own way, to a question, which we might call "So what?" or "Ike." We've mentioned how the Bernardin Center and CTU have as our mission, bringing the church to the world. So in what ways, and I'll ask Miguel first, in what ways do you each consider your books as offering something like a public theology?
So one of the things, thank you, Steve, for that question. One of the, particularly when we deal with issues of gender and sexuality, issues that affect the body, it's particularly in this area, are issues that cause much suffering, marginalization, rejection, injustice, both within private as well as public spaces. They concern familial, ecclesial, as well as public relations. And I think a book like Queer God More speaks across those different contexts. Recently, I had the honor and it was a really hard conversation, but I met with Joyce Calvo, the mother of Alana Chen, who in 2019 was the young woman who committed suicide as a result of her sexual orientation. And we sat there in Denver at the AR in a coffee place, and we cried. We cried because that life should have never been lost. I visited Pope Francis last year and had a conversation with Francis, and Alana's mother had asked me to talk to Pope Francis and to share the story of Alana, and I did. And this book is not just an academic book, but this book is written precisely because the church needs to wake up. Society needs to wake up. And one more life is one more life too many. I mentioned how poetry is open-ended. The poetry of John of the Cross is also sometimes very seductively homoerotic. Take, for instance, the first words of his spiritual canticle poem. ¿A dónde te escondiste? The Spanish is very clear in the gender here. Amado, y me dejaste con gemido. Where have you hidden, my beloved, is the translation we give. But it's really from a homoerotic place, is where have you hidden my veiled lover and have left me here mourning after your presence, very explicit sexual terms. If you are a queer Catholic male and you love this God, how can you not identify with those words in ways that evoke your concrete humanity in a holy way, not in a sinful way? And so whether it's the private or the public, the effort to rethink the theology of God, I hope, carries on effect not just within the academy and within the church, but also in a society that increasingly is becoming, in some places, again, very homophobic and homoerotic. I mean, and heteronormative to the sense of causing injustices to some, to some human beings. On that note, I'm extremely grateful to Pope Francis for what he did last week, or the last 2 weeks, in terms of declaring that the criminalization of homosexuality is never to be accepted. That is a huge step forward, and as a former diplomat, I can tell you that those words will have a very positive impact for the work of diplomacy and the work of human rights. And so, perhaps because I see this as an issue of life, I conclude my book with the question of what is not saved, what is not assumed is not saved. And let me just read briefly from there, and I'll stop. If Christ does not mediate the omnisexual mystery of God, and by mediating I mean a God inclusive of human experiences that can relate to persons on the basis of their gender identity and sexual orientation, then it seems to me that some members of the human family of God cannot be saved. This is the fundamental implication that we can draw from Christian soteriology. As Elizabeth Johnson writes with respect to women's embodiment, quote, if maleness is constitutive of the incarnation and redemption, female humanity is not assumed and therefore not saved, end of quote. I would argue that similarly, we can affirm that if heterosexuality is constitutive for the incarnation, if Christ and his offer of salvation and grace can only be conceived through the experience of a straight and male humanity, then I'm afraid that queer humanity cannot be assumed and therefore cannot fully participate in God's triumph, life, and mystery.
Jean-Pierre.
You know, I've been following with considerable attention Pope Francis's recent apostolic visit to the Democratic Republic of Congo and to South Sudan. Since the beginning of the pontificate, this first Pope from the global South, this first Pope from the American hemisphere, has insisted on a culture of dialogue, has insisted on a culture of encounter. And by looking at encounter as a reality that pervaded the gathering of the Amazonian Synod, and that was prepared for in the documents of Aparecida and earlier documents of the Latin American Bishops' Conference, we're seeing what an openness to a global culture of encounter really means. And in this respect, I think there is a very important agenda on the part of this first Pope from the global South, this first Pope from the American hemisphere, in a certain sense, to undo a centuries-old legacy of erasure and ignoring. The erasure of indigenous cultures, the literal physical erasure of indigenous peoples in Amazonia and elsewhere, and an openness to elevating their active participation as agents in a culture of dialogue. You know, and this is something that those of us who live in the global North need to pay attention to, because the legacies of colonialism are still very much alive and well, not the least in Puerto Rico, which one author has spoken of as the last and oldest colony in the world. So these are not just matters of historical curiosity, but these are legacies that continue to affect the world in which we live. And the lifting up of voices that have been marginalized, the lifting up of voices that have been suppressed, the lifting up of voices that have not been included in what we understand as divine self-disclosure in terms of the doctrine of the incarnation. This is very important as a matter of public theology, I think.
And that is going to do it for us tonight. I do feel obligated to do one last very important piece of business. 3 volumes, as Carmen said, in the Disruptive Cartographers Doing Theology Latinamente series from Fordham University Press are The Word Became Culture, edited by Miguel Diaz, Revelation in the Vernacular by Jean-Pierre Ruiz, and Queer God de Amor, also by Miguel Diaz. This is the business part. Those volumes are available here in the room for purchase immediately, through the courtesy of our neighbor here in Hyde Park, Chicago's Seminary Co-op bookstore. And if you buy his volumes here, there's a good chance Miguel will sign them for you. But if you're part of our Zoom audience, let me encourage you not only to buy these volumes, but also to support an independent bookstore while you do it. Seminary Co-op bookstore is a jewel, a destination you should visit in Chicago, but also visit them online to buy these books. And we're putting their web address in the chat for those of you who are with us on Zoom right now. We hope you'll visit them, and we are always grateful to our friends from the Seminary Co-op for all of their support and friendship. We've been here tonight celebrating 40 years of CTU's Hispanic Theology and Ministry program, as Carmen reminded us, a program almost as old as CTU and one of the first of its kind. Yet even while we pause to celebrate tonight and give thanks, that work goes on. So be watching CTU's website for future events, while our Hispanic Theology and Ministry program continues to be an important part of how CTU prepares ministers and scholars for the church of tomorrow. We're grateful that you have been with us tonight. Please stay in touch with us. For all of us here at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago's beautiful Hyde Park neighborhood, gracias y buenas noches.